Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Be Unbound podcast. I'm Ben Billups. I do the marketing for Unbound, and I'm joined once again this week by our CEO, Jonathan Brush, and our Director of Courses and Content, Victoria Grant. Thanks for coming back on the show.
It's great to be here.
Thank you.
Right on. And so this week, we're kind of changing things up a little bit with the podcast. For the last few weeks, for the last several weeks, we've been giving you updates about the company. We've been talking about the transition that happened in early July. And we've also been pretty heavily plugging, our Ascend program deadline, the Spark deadline, the Navigate deadline. We've had a lot of deadlines, but right now we don't have a lot of deadlines. And we'd actually love to get more into some of the content, to talk more about kind of education philosophy, talk about cultural issues, and to talk about community, which happens to be our topic this week. So Jonathan obviously has spent over a decade at this point developing communities, especially in particular with Unbound, the Unbound community, working with the Unbound community. And Victoria has been a part of the Unbound community for, almost as long. How long have you been a part of the Unbound? Do you know?
Not quite as long. I want to say it's 4-ish years, 4 or 5 years.
Okay.
Oh, it's got to be more than that. It's got to be closer to 7 if you go the first CP3. So,
well, there you go. So about 7 years a part of it. And then now as the Director of Courses and Content, she really helps manage the student experience for our new Ascend students, and the way that, that they get integrated into the community and the way that the teams work, just like we talked about last week. So excited to have you guys on. And I think one of the things that's kind of one of the glaringly obvious changes to not just community, but also the way that kind of education works in the last 6 to 8 months has been that a lot of students are studying online now with the pandemic restrictions. And so, up until this point, it was pretty much the overwhelming expectation that a student would finish high school and then they would move away from home. So they'd leave their community, they move away from home, and then they would, go to college somewhere and they'd try to integrate into a new community, make new friends. And then they would spend about 4 years there. And if you're lucky, you meet a couple lifelong friends at college. Students have different experiences and then they go about their lives. And then typically they move for jobs, for the rest of their lives. And so I think just looking at the way that this has changed, and in particular with Unbound, we're used to what many people consider the reality now, which is studying online, studying remote, studying from home. And so I would just love to hear from both of you guys about what do you think is the impact for students for kind of not having that culture shock of moving away from home and going to college when they complete high school?
Well, I think that's kind of an interesting phraseology right there, is that culture shock. And I think one of the things that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. So I spent about 12 years working for traditional college and went to traditional college myself. And so I've seen that and witnessed that and had that background before I came to Unbound. And it's a little bit of an interesting thing. We expect that culture shock. And I just have a friend recently who's been going through some of this. And we think that's kind of normal. And that, in order to sort of transition to becoming an adult, it's necessary to sort of break all bonds with home and family and completely establish and start from ground zero. Now, I want to say this carefully. It's not that I think that that's wrong or incorrect or that cannot be positive in some ways. And there's certainly many instances, including my own, where that ended up being a very positive experience. But several years ago, I started to ask the question, was that, first of all, normative? And was that always 100% to the advantage of the student and the community? And one of the things that's kind of interesting is it's certainly not normative, right? The idea that you would invest 18 years, 15 years, 10 years in a community, build all those relationships, all those connections, all those interlocking networks, and then sort of blow that up and go back to zero and start over again. That's not the typical pattern for most of history. It would be a phenomenon that's probably only been really normative in our culture and Western civilization since about the 1950s on. And so prior to that, people would have stayed in their communities and would have had those connections. Now, again, there can be advantages to that, and there's certainly some interesting things. But one of the intriguing things about online education is that you now have this unique opportunity where you can get a lot of the advantages that people would take from leaving home and starting zero. An education, for starters, a connection to a network of high performing people. If you left home to go to college, you went to a place where maybe there wasn't as much education opportunity to a place that everybody was immersed in higher education. So you kind of connect to a different peer group, and yet you don't have to break all the bonds with home and family. And I think that opens up some really intriguing possibilities, and it really changes things pretty dramatically. And one of the things that I think that is important is just to sort of pause and say, do we have to accept that it's normal, expected, and the only option to start from zero? Or are there actually some pretty unique advantages if you can take all those relationships that you've had for 10, 15, 18 years, continue to build on them while expanding your network to include some high performing people that might be able to open up doors for you in the future?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think like Victoria, you and I, as like students who went through Unbound, we can actually speak to kind of what that experience is like as a student. So I'm maybe kind of curious to hear if you have any thoughts about that, even just what your experience was like and that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I would be happy to speak to that from a little bit of personal experience as well. Um, Mine's actually a bit interesting of a situation because I did both. So I finished high school, I did all of college online, and was able to stay in the community I grew up in for that whole process. And then afterwards, after year two, I ended up going to grad school, and that required a move across the country and relocating and kind of experiencing that culture shock that you were talking about. So interestingly, I think a lot of it is relates to the person, like as personal to the situation and to the student. So there are some rules across the board, but a lot of students, I think, will find that while there will be changes, from moving across the country, a lot of that community will end up being what they make of it. So if they're able and willing to stay plugged in and to make the effort to keep those relationships alive, even though it's going to look different, right? It has to. Long distance relationships and online relationships will look different. But if they're willing to put the effort in to prioritize those and to keep them going and keep them alive, then I think they can still benefit some of those, from some of those relationships and those connections they've grown up with, even as they're in a new situation. But I think it is important to challenge the paradigm that you have to move. I know that was the expectation from all of my extended family and a lot of friends and stuff. It's like, okay, you finished high school, like where are you going? Time to head out. And it was definitely a surprise to them that I wasn't, and that I was going to kind of stay plugged in. My family just adopted, and I really wanted to kind of be there and be a part of it. And I don't regret that at all. But nor do I regret my move for school. That was good for different reasons. So yeah, again, I think it comes back to the student and whether or not they're willing to, as an individual, prioritize community. And I think that's where we trip up a lot, is we kind of miss that crucial step of owning our community ourselves and instead just letting community happen to us.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, Ben, we have you raise this question as well, because you have a kind of a unique situation that's maybe in the middle of that, where, you are not necessarily in the immediate area that you grew up in, but you've taken advantage of networks that you built in your high school years in many, many different ways. So maybe you should answer the question too.
You talking about me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I missed that. Yeah. So I think it's interesting. It's very interesting because I had a couple of really good friends in high school, but I didn't have this what most people would consider a community, this really kind of well-rounded. I didn't really have that, but I had a couple of good friends, and I stayed in touch with them. And that's something that I've even given talks about in terms of just how to develop your career is I think 3 out of 5 jobs I've had so far, I got out of one high school friend who was just really well networked and knew what I was capable of doing. And even just something as simple as that, that relationship has been invaluable, not just because I could say I got these things out of it, which is great, but because we're friends and we're still friends. And we're in a little mastermind group together where every couple months we'll go over each other's ideas and try to refine things and hold each other accountable. And so that relationship has been really phenomenal. And that's something that if I had gone to college, I probably largely would have walked away from, particularly because as an Unbound student, one of the main, we really worked together a lot while I was in college on some film projects. And that was when we both, kind of went from just sort of knowing each other's friends to also having professional experience with each other. So we could endorse each other for things like jobs. So I think, in that sense, just the value of being an Unbound student, was very apparent to me, and has been for several years since that. and I also, but like at the same time, it's like there's a mix. And I think, Victoria, what you said about not letting community just happen to you, like it's not just about your environment, or it's not just about the people you work with. That's something that I feel like, that's one of those lessons I feel like I've maybe learned the hard way, where there were times in my life where I really didn't invest in relationships very much. And so I didn't really have a community. And then my community was basically like people that I happen to work with, which for the most part have been great. Like I haven't had a lot of like terrible coworkers, fortunately, but it's been more of a thing where it wasn't something that I chose or invested in or did intentionally. And I think that kind of no matter where you are, having that attitude is so important, to really like giving back to the community, and then also kind of becoming a role model in the community for like, this is a way to lead, and this is the way to invest in people, and kind of becoming that person, I think is a really big step in maturing in general, instead of just saying, well, I'm in this environment, I know these people, I hang out with them, and then when I'm not in that environment anymore, I don't. And with Unbound, students have to be, or really any, I would say any online college community, like remote community, you have to be intentional, because you're not going to talk to that person if you don't call them. Like you're not just going to see them at class. Or if you go to an event, etc. So
that intentionality might be the really important piece here. And that might be the crux of kind of the things that we're saying, is that deliberate thinking about community. And maybe just to go back to what we talked about at the beginning and clarify that a little bit more, I'm really hesitant to say you should stay in a community or you shouldn't stay in a community, or you should move or you shouldn't move. I think that has to do a lot with a ton of individual factors that I couldn't know and that only the individual knows. But the real key, if I had to say like, hey, think about this, would be being intentional about it, to sort of think that through. And I might kind of put up some ideas and say, like there are advantages always to leaving home and having new horizons and building new networks, seeing new things, experiencing new things. All three of us have done extensive traveling and have been around lots of places. And we would say that is a key piece of our education and our development as people. And, we wouldn't turn that down in terms of, we know people all over the country. And yet at the same time, that part is often more obvious in our culture. And so I would kind of challenge people to say, okay, we'll turn it around and think about the other side, and, project out a little bit and say, okay, you lived in this place for a long time. There's people that know your reputation and know what you can do. Those are really important contacts. They could be really good business contacts. People and have a connection to a church or a community. Those are really important quality of living contacts. That really changes. It makes a huge difference into your satisfaction with life. And then don't underestimate the importance of having family close by. Study after study after study has shown that, if you have extended family in the area, almost everything about life becomes easier. Childcare becomes easier, economic stuff becomes easier, networking becomes easier, satisfaction of life becomes easier. Now, those factors can be really different for you. You could have a bad family situation. You could have a community you just recently come into. You could have a community that has no opportunity. You could have a place where you're not really connected to anybody. Those are all great reasons to move. But the point is the intentionality, to think about it and to think, instead of like your own personal development, to think of your personal development in relationship to others, which is a community aspect, and really think carefully about the advantages and disadvantages of it, and then make the appropriate decision, which could be to stay or could be to go. But again, the point would be, have you factored community into your decision making?
Yeah. And I think part of what's kind of the counterintuitive part of what's considered conventional in the model that you grow up somewhere and then you're going to move away is just like what you were alluding to earlier, Jonathan, which is like you spent 18 years getting to know people and then you just decide to move away. Like you said, moving away might be the right decision. That might be the right next step. But if you're just looking at it from the perspective that you've had all these years to invest and to get to know people and you have family nearby, moving away, it seems like you would need a better case to move away than you would to stay. Or you need a special reason. Maybe you want particular education, something like that. And those can all be fine. But I think I find it interesting that it's considered strange if you don't move away. Just like what Victoria was talking about, where, people kind of expect her to move and then she didn't. I had the same experience. I'd go to church and people would be like, you're still here, basically. Yeah, exactly. You're still here. And it was funny because at the time, it's like I was making decent full-time wages. I was living at home and I was saving every penny. And like, when I look back on that, I'm like, I'm super glad I did that. And but everybody was saying like, oh, well, when are you going to move out? Because that's considered like a kind of a sign of maturity in modern culture, which it can be, because when you do that, you have to grow up a little bit, but it doesn't have to be. You can mature without having to have that experience. It all depends. But I think too, because I've kind of had my fair share of bouncing around, and so in that sense, like I'm grateful for having that experience, because I feel like there's a lot of different environments where I can make new friends, like, and build relationships. Like those are things that I've done to the extent where it's like, I know I can do that. But at the same time, given that it's kind of expected, especially in American society, to move so much. So like you're going to move for your career several times through your life if you're really sort of climbing the ladder, so to speak. I'm kind of curious to hear from you guys. Do you ever feel like, or do you think that kind of commoditizes community to where they're like, well, the thing that's really important is that you move up in life and that you make as much money as possible. And when you get somewhere, just kind of make a couple friends. Like that's sort of how it's treated, instead of saying, well, the most important thing is the people that you're around and how they're going to influence your life.
Victoria, you want to go first and then I'll follow up? I think I took the first and last one.
Yeah, definitely. I don't know, Ben, this is a really interesting question. And I think it does come back to the individual. I could see it going both ways, but I do think across the board that we have devalued community as a culture. Early on, I think communities were an integral part of Western culture, in large part because they were needed to survive. But as we have progressed, and you guys referred to, our focus on individualism and what works for me. And Ben, it was interesting. You talked about, moving somewhere new, finding a few friends and saying, great, I'm set. This is where I'm at. I've arrived. And I wonder if that plays into this too, that it's also a redefining of community. We don't have the same traditional communities as we used to. And I wonder if now as a culture, we've also, redefined that concept to being just a few friends, or just being, I live in a community of, retired golfers. Well, okay, that is technically true, but that's not really your community. And I just wonder maybe if that plays into it too, that we've redefined what community even is as a culture and as a generation.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, again, it comes back to asking that question. And I've been sort of intrigued and challenged by people who have answered that differently, what it means for them. I have good friends who I was having dinner with, I think it's a year or so ago, and we were just catching up and talking about sort of life choices. And this individual graduated from college, got a professional degree in healthcare, had really good job options, but those job options were typically much, much, much better in a big city. And so he and his wife and young family were living there, and they were kind of miserable and things weren't going really great, although it was great on the job front. And all of a sudden they sat down one day and they said, wait a second, we're asking this strange question here. We're asking the questions, what's best for my career? Why do we have to ask that question first? What if we ask what's best for us? And if we ask what's best for us as our entire family, what makes a bigger difference is the community. Well, what's the biggest touchstone for us in our community? Well, that's the church. What if we decided where to live based entirely on the church and then figured out everything else out from there? And that caused him to move back to a very rural area where he had grown up, where he had family and connections and an exceptionally strong church. Now, when he did that, other things fell into place, and he wound up opening up a branch of the healthcare place he was working for. He put up a branch in that community, and things worked out really well. But he said he was willing to even give up his healthcare job and do something totally different if necessary for a while, because that just seemed like a better decision. And I thought that was really intriguing. Like that was the first time I kind of sat back and thought, wow, to think about that first. And then I have some personal experience with that. I did leave home and moved about an hour and a half away. And that did open up new horizons for me. So again, coming back to individual choices, that was the best opportunity for me at the time. Of course, online education wasn't an issue either. But in the early part of my career, the only way to really advance was to change schools. And that would mean moving all over the country. And so, many people told me what you need to do is you need to keep moving up the ladder by shifting to communities. And all of those communities have been several hours to several states away. Mm-hmm. And I really resisted that because I loved our community. I loved the church we were in. I loved the place that we were working. And then not that long ago, we had an opportunity to move clear across the country. And again, we looked at that and I thought, if I move across the country, one of the things that I'm doing is I'm saying that my kids will no longer have a relationship with their grandparents, because we at the time lived between both sets of grandparents who were all alive. They were less than an hour and a half away, and we saw them very regularly. And if we moved across the country with plane tickets and everything else, maybe we'd see those grandparents once every other year. And we kind of, my wife and I looked at that and said, this is a great opportunity. It's a great professional opportunity. I'm sure we'd do well. I'm sure that we would find a community in this new place, but at what cost? And that's been very interesting. So now we've lived in the same place for over 20 years. And this is the part that people don't see. There is a richness to that long-term investment in people and community and places that's not apparent initially, but becomes apparent over years when you have shared, somebody's grandparents, and the people that were alive that are no longer alive, and their children when they were in diapers, the children when they went to school, and their connections and when they lost this job, when their house burned down, and all this kind of stuff. That kind of collective memory and collective experience really enriches over time in a way that's hard to sort of articulate or even understand until it's been experienced. And again, it's not that that's the only way. It's not that if you're not doing that, you're doing something wrong. It's just that don't neglect the understanding or asking the questions of the value of that, and realize that it can make a major impact in your life. At the end of all this, I probably have made a lot less money than I could have otherwise, but it's never been a factor, right? The richness of our life has been tremendously different. We can look back on that and say, those are great decisions. So.
Absolutely. And I think a big reason why we see kind of that sort of devaluation of community is really a byproduct of access, which is, if you roll the clock back 100, 200 years, leaving your community was a way bigger deal than it is now, not just from the standpoint of, networking and like work, but also from like standpoint of survival, even depending on how far back you roll the clock. Like it was just a terrible idea to leave your community. And I think too that on the flip side, there's this idea that I think if you're sort of constantly moving in and out of different communities, it also makes it a lot easier to just kind of leave when it gets hard. So it's like when you find yourself at the bottom of the totem pole, or you find yourself discredited in some way, or maybe somebody's undermining you in your own community, and you don't really have as much motivation to stick it out or to repair those relationships if you can just kind of jump somewhere else and build new relationships. And so I think that's changed the dynamic too, is because, and Jonathan, you and I have talked about this before, but it is, to me, it's wild that, because of the internet and because of the ease of travel, if I wanted to live and work in New York 3 months from today, I could do it. Like I could just start applying for jobs and, find somebody that would hire me and then just move to New York. And the fact that that's something that I can plan and do in the space of like less than 6 months or a year is just crazy by most standards. That's something that didn't exist before. And so, there's pros and cons to that. On the one hand, I have access to these incredible opportunities I wouldn't have access to otherwise. I wouldn't work for you guys if we didn't have the internet, right? And so that's really cool. But, on the flip side, it makes it easier for me to just say, oh, this is hard, and leave. And kind of, and I think that might be why, or at least it's a contributing factor to why the time that we live in is so heavy on the emphasis on individualism. Everybody's talking about how they're going to build their personal brand or how to basically become your own celebrity. And because of the internet, it's actually not hard to become a celebrity. And if you find the right niche and you kind of spend time building an audience, like you're a celebrity and you can make money. And so I guess in kind of with that as context, what do you guys see as the need and role of community? I think particularly at a time when people don't maybe feel that need as much as they would have in the past.
I think that there's proximity ensures authenticity, or maybe there's maybe a better way to say that is there's a direct relationship between proximity and authenticity. And so, so there's interesting what you say, Ben, like you could just move up, pick up moves in New York, stuff like that. But this is what that intentionality comes back. It's where that intentionality comes back again, where yes, but that same factor also means you could stay in a community that may have been a dead end for you economically, but may be rich in other ways. In other words, in this rural community I was talking about before, there's another individual who works there who would never been able to stay there, except for the technology allows him to work a global job from a small rural community and allow him to sort of do both. And so there's that kind of, you can choose to use it in both ways. But to come back to your point about internet celebrity and all those things, as intriguing and as attractive as that may be, at root, everybody knows that if you have 1,000 Facebook friends, you don't really have any friends. That you have, zillions of followers on Instagram, does that mean that anybody really knows you? And there's this heart cry of authenticity among folks, especially of younger generations. And so, authenticity is only possible with proximity. And so the farther somebody is from you, the less authentic you can be. If you are on the other side of the country and all you see is my Instagram posts, then you know only this much of me, this little tiny little piece, right? But if you live next to me and you're in my house every week and you see me at church and you run across me all the time and you see me in the community when I'm involved in, then it's pretty tough to hide stuff. You get to see the good parts and the bad parts. And that's, again, I think, Ben, you alluded to this as well, that, there's a hidden, not apparent advantage, something that's hard. So we can think of this in physical fitness, right? You don't get physically fit unless you do the hard stuff. The hard stuff makes you sweat and makes you hurt and makes you sore. And yet you need to get that. That's true everywhere in life. That's a principle that is just as true as gravity, right? And so, if you're in a place where you're moving all the time, there's always a honeymoon period with any relationship. And so, just about the time things get tough, it's like, okay, time to leave, change jobs, change communities, whatever. If you stay, always gets ugly because authenticity goes up and all the warts of the people. And I've been in church with people for 20 plus years. I know all the things that they do wrong and they knew all the stupid stuff I do. And we've got cringeworthy memories of when we stuck our foot in our mouth in a board meeting, or we did some idiotic thing, or we just made a complete screw up of something. And, there's a lot of those things that I would be great to have been able to run from. And yet I didn't, and we didn't, and we know that about each other, and we still love each other. And now we love each other despite our faults that we're very aware of. That's a pretty deep, authentic love. And now all of a sudden you get to the point where now I know people that will come no matter what, because they don't like me just because I'm charming or because I can do one thing good. They know me even though they know I'm a low down, lousy so-and-so who's completely capable of idiotic, stupid stuff. And they still love me. And so they'd still be there. And that's you can't get to authenticity without proximity. So, Victoria?
I think that actually summed it up really well. And I've been, this is a concept I've been researching lately, actually. And, Ben, you asked about the need for the role of community. And I think especially in the millennial and Gen Z generation, it's extremely telling when you look at the stats and see just how disconnected we are. We consistently rate as the loneliest generation in American history, which for being the most quote unquote connected generation in American history is kind of remarkable. And honestly, I think that does justice to the concept of why do we need this? Well, because we're falling apart. Like our generation is not doing great when it comes to relationships, when it comes to people. And I think, obviously there are a lot of different factors that play into that, but, compare Gen Zs and millennials to, baby boomers. And yes, we each have issues and there's, unique stuff going on for both. But relationally speaking, across the board, making generalizations here, baby boomers were by and large connected in a way that millennials and Gen Zs aren't. And they didn't experience all of the same issues of community and loneliness that we're experiencing now. So, I think that's a great place to start. Why do we need it? Because we were designed for community. We need people. And when you look at communities or at generations in places that have that, then we see a lot of strength and support that is lacking in our generation as well.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth jumping in here and saying that this is not about how one generation is better than another, because it's those boomers and those Xers who gave us this freaking technology. So, it's basically their fault is what I'm saying. Because kind of like the goal here is to find a generation and then place blame, and preferably it's a generation that's not yours. So that way you could kind of create an enemy and sort of push all your problems out there. So
yeah, if you're young, it's all the old people. If it's your old people, it's all the young people.
Exactly.
I see how this builds community. This is great.
Yeah. This is an intergenerational podcast. But
It is one-sided, but it is.
There you go. Well, on a somewhat more sober note, I think it kind of in a topic to close on is just to also kind of touch on how coronavirus has changed a lot of these dynamics. And one of the sort of lesser reported impacts of all of this shutdown is just skyrocketing rates of suicide and substance abuse because people are finding themselves isolated and lonely, and they're returning to bad habits and bad thought patterns. And it takes, again, like we talked about with the Unbound community, how you have to be so intentional. I think there's a level of intentionality that many people weren't used to up till now because they just saw this guy every day and now they don't. And so I think, I guess I'd love to hear from both of you guys, and maybe we can start with Victoria and then kind of go on the round, which is just sort of, what do you think we can learn from community about this? We've touched on a lot of those points so far, and then also, what are ways that some of our listeners can engage in community, even in the face of, with restrictions still in place in many locations of the United States?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a good question, and I think it comes back down around again to the issue of being intentional about this, because each person's situation is slightly different. I know, even in some of my personal situations, it takes different types of intentionality to stay connected to different friends, to different family members. And I think that as we look at what it takes to stay connected in the midst of restrictions and the lack of being able to physically be together, it's going to take even greater levels of intentionality and reaching out. So I think we need to ask ourselves, what relationships do we really need to cultivate, and what's it going to take to do that? And then equally paramount is asking for accountability. And that's not something that's easy. And that's usually something that we buck against, especially in our individualistic culture. We don't think that we need that.
Mm-hmm.
Au contraire, when you look at the stats and see what the results are. So I think seeking out that accountability also is something that's going to make a difference as we can't physically meet together, as we experience, like you're talking about, Ben, all of these kind of side effects of that shutdown. If we are intentional about staying connected, about reaching out, about having those conversations, about staying accountable, even when we don't want to, even when it's not fun. I think that's where we need to start.
Absolutely.
I think this may kind of throw back to some of our educational philosophy too. I think, if you see something like all the suicides and there's all these substance abuse and things like that, there's a couple reactions to that. One is just despair, or one is, what can I do? Or one is to think, well, in order to do this, I must, and you kind of insert the answer that seems to be the most predominant. And because we have an answer first educational philosophy, right? Like, here's a problem, find the answer, do the answer. And so I would say that what Victoria said is true. And I would also kind of summarize our entire thing here. We talk about intentionality, action. So action is required. Okay, we have a situation, and so we need action. Well, what does action require? Well, action requires a belief and a question, and it's answering the question that produces the action. So one of the things that I would kind of say here is, like, if we take everything we just summarized, let me put it to you this way. So, we have a belief that we're sharing with you. The community is really important, probably has outsized importance, and should be a real serious factor in your considerations of how you make your life choices, right? Okay, so there's a belief. Now you evaluate that belief and look at it and say, yeah, I think that makes sense, or no, it doesn't, right? I mean, you have that option. And so, but if you say, okay, yes, it does. All right, now you believe something about community. Now ask yourself a question, how then, since I now believe the community is important, how do I build community in my area? And here's the thing, we're not giving you an answer and say, do this. Hey, if you're going to fix suicide rates, what you need to do is start a blank campaign and do this and that and the other thing. And you're like, okay, great. No, we're saying that we have no idea what your community looks like. We have no idea what your situation looks like. So what can we teach you to be effective here? Well, we can teach you some belief so that you have a foundational kind of principle to stand on. And then we can tell you, okay, now ask a good question. And if you ask the question, how can I build community? I have no idea what that answer is. But here's something we believe really deeply. If you ask the question, it produces action. Then your mind starts working and you're starting to look for opportunities. You're looking for possibilities. You're going, oh, I've been asking this question. I had no idea, but now this person over here just said something and that just clicked something. And now I've got an opportunity to do something, and that produces action. So we're going to summarize everything: a belief in community, and then ask the question, a belief in community, belief there's a problem, suicide and substance abuse. Now ask the question, what can you do about that? I don't know what that answer is for you, but I bet you'll find one, and I bet you'll leave it to action. And don't ever underappreciate how much a small action can make a big difference, right? Start somewhere and then keep asking the question. Don't be satisfied with the answer. Well, ask the question, what should I do? I should do this. Okay, what should you do next? And now what you learn from that, what should you do next? And now what you learn from that, what should you do next? That's the kind of action that builds movements and ultimately builds communities.
Well, there you have it, folks. I will refrain from offering any more specific answers, and I will let the question stand. Yeah, so maybe that's the application for our audience, which is ask yourself, what's something, who can I reach out to? How can I build community in my area? How can I invest in relationships? While there's still some restrictions in place. If you're comfortable meeting up, maybe meeting up's the answer. If you just want to make a phone call, maybe that's the answer. It just depends. And something that I'm really excited about too is in about 2 weeks, Spark events are going to start. Apex Spark events, which are the regional Unbound events that are replacing Apex this year. And I'm really excited about it because these are going to be smaller, more intimate. They're going to be more about building relationships, and the events are going to include some community challenges. So really looking forward to seeing how our students, not just seeing our students, but also seeing how our students engage in community at those events. Well, Jonathan, Victoria, I really appreciate your time. This has been,
just one question about those Spark events. I was thinking, we're talking about community, right? And there's students out there that hear this, and about the Unbound community and stuff like that. But I hope, especially as we talk about some of these broader topics, they're reaching outside the community. You may have just found out about Unbound. You may be intrigued by us, or maybe you have a friend in the program, something like that. You're hearing this. These Spark events are all about community. So if this whole idea intrigued you, take a look at our website. Find the Spark events are. Friday night's kind of an open house night for these Spark events, and it's for anybody to sort of show up. And so if you're in the area or want to be in the area and you want to sort of find out what this Unbound community is like, and you have no connections to us whatsoever, we're inviting you, giving you an open invitation to show up on Friday night and kind of check things out. And so give us a call and let us know you're coming so we can be prepared for you. But, come show up and take a look and see what it's like and get a chance to experience that community. And maybe that's a question you can ask and an immediate solution for you. So sorry, Ben.
No, that's perfect. So yeah, absolutely. If that sounds interesting to you guys, you can go to beunbound.us/spark to see where the events are and when they're happening. There's one in Texas, Colorado, Indiana, and Virginia. And so you can see where the events are. And if you're interested in coming, you can email cabinet@beunbound.us to let us know that to expect you. And so with that, once again, thank you guys so much for listening. Thank you, Jonathan and Victoria, for joining us. And we'll catch you guys next week.